The Galactic Naval Academy occupied 17 square miles of pristine real estate on Station Apex, and every single inch of it was currently terrified of one cadet. His name was Null. Not Cadet Null, just Null. Because apparently when you're a crystalline life form from Shardis, your entire species subscribes to the minimalist school of naming conventions. Null stood approximately 7 feet tall, was composed of interlocking geometric shapes that refracted light in ways that gave people headaches, and had the personality of a tactical nuclear weapon mixed with a tax audit. He was also, unfortunately, the best cadet the Academy had seen in 47 years. "Simulation complete," announced the training hall's artificial intelligence, in a tone that suggested it was also tired of Null's nonsense. "Cadet Null achieves perfect score, again, for the 15th consecutive day. The rest of you have failed. Again." Across the tactical arena, Cadet Torque slammed one massive scaled fist against his console. The reptilian had gone through 6 consoles this semester. The Academy had started ordering them in bulk. "How?" Torque demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "I studied his previous 17 strategies. I adapted, I innovated, I even sacrificed my forward position to bait him into a trap." "Your trap was obvious," Null said, his voice emanating from somewhere within his crystalline structure with all the warmth of deep space. "Your feint was predictable. Your innovation was merely a variation on classical Vortan siege doctrine, Chapter 7, Subsection 12. I accounted for it in my opening move." Torque's eye twitched. It had been twitching a lot lately. Near the observation deck, Cadet Vin wobbled excitedly. Vin was a fungus-based life form from Sporus Prime, which meant he looked like a 5-foot-tall mushroom with too many appendages and an even worse understanding of personal boundaries. "That was amazing, Null. The way you predicted the cascade failure in the enemy supply line was like watching a master conductor. Can I study your notes? We could grab some nutrient paste together and discuss your tactical philosophy. I make a great study partner. I literally never sleep because my species doesn't have a sleep cycle. We could be up all night every night. Doesn't that sound fun?" Null rotated several of his crystalline segments in what might have been the alien equivalent of a grimace. "No. Maybe tomorrow then," Finn said cheerfully, completely missing the point. Commander Brext stood at the front of the training hall, all 4 of his arms crossed in various states of disappointment. The Kelzorian officer had been teaching tactical doctrine for 23 years, and in that time he had never encountered a cadet quite like Null. Brilliant, yes. Insufferable, absolutely. But there was something else there too, a complete inability to understand that warfare wasn't just math and predictions. It was chaos and improvisation, and sometimes just dumb luck. "Cadet Null," Brext said, his mandibles clicking with barely contained frustration. "Your performance is, as always, technically flawless. However, I would remind you that in actual combat situations, you will be working with a team. Your tendency to dismiss your squad mates' suggestions is becoming problematic." "Their suggestions are statistically inferior to my calculations," Null replied. "I dismiss them because implementing them would reduce our probability of success. You dismiss them because you can't imagine being wrong." Brext muttered under his breath, then louder. "Dismissed! All of you! And before you leave, I have an announcement." The cadets, grateful to escape another Null lecture, started gathering their equipment. "We have 2 new arrivals joining us mid-semester," Brext continued. "They'll be integrating into your tactical squadrons starting tomorrow, a human named Elena Martinez and her partner." The room went quiet. Humans were rare in the Academy. They'd only joined the Galactic Council 15 years ago, and most of them were still figuring out which end of a plasma rifle was which. A human, Torque perked up slightly. Finally, someone who might actually come in below me in the rankings. Null said nothing, but several of his facets rotated in what might have been dismissive interest. Another variable to account for. Another inferior tactical mind to work around. Another cadet who would slow down his inevitable rise to fleet command. What Null didn't know, couldn't have predicted, and would spend the next several days utterly baffled by, was that Elena Martinez's partner wasn't another cadet. It was a cat, and that cat was about to teach the Academy's most brilliant tactical mind a lesson in chaos theory. Elena Martinez walked into the Galactic Naval Academy like she owned the place, which was impressive considering she'd arrived approximately 45 minutes ago and was still figuring out which doors opened automatically and which required complex alien gestures she hadn't learned yet. She was average height for a human, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, brown skin, and the kind of relaxed confidence that came from either deep wisdom or absolutely no idea how much danger she was in. In Elena's case, it might have been both. In her arms, she carried a small orange and white creature that looked like evolution had designed it specifically to knock things off tables and judge people. "Is that," Commander Brext said slowly, staring at the creature, "a Terran feline?" "This is Professor Whiskers," Elena said brightly. "He's my tactical advisor." The dozen or so cadets in the orientation hall went silent. Null, who had been reviewing star charts in the corner, rotated several segments to focus on the new arrivals. "Your tactical advisor," Brext repeated, his voice flat, "is a cat." "Technically, he's a senior tactical consultant," Elena corrected. "I don't want to oversell his credentials." Professor Whiskers, for his part, was engaged in the extremely important task of staring at a point approximately 3 feet to the left of Brext's head. To any observer, there was nothing there. The cat remained unconvinced. Vin wobbled forward excitedly. "Oh wow, a Terran companion species. I've read about these. They were worshipped as gods in ancient Earth cultures. They have extraordinary sensory capabilities. They can detect vibrations, see in near darkness, and their reflexes are 17 times faster than baseline humans. This is so exciting. Can I touch him?" Vin reached out with one of his fungal appendages. Professor Whiskers' eyes locked onto the movement with the cold precision of a predator whose ancestors had hunted prey for millions of years, one paw extended, claws emerging. "I wouldn't," Elena said calmly. Vin touched the cat anyway. Professor Whiskers' response was immediate and surgical. A single swipe, no claws extended, just enough force to communicate absolute disapproval. Vin withdrew his appendage, somehow looking hurt despite not having a face as most species understood it. "He seems nice." Torque lumbered forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Elena. "So, let me get this straight. You brought a small Terran predator to a military academy and expect us to believe it's qualified to advise on tactical operations." "I mean, I wouldn't say he's qualified exactly," Elena said, "but he's got opinions and sometimes they're useful." As if to demonstrate, Professor Whiskers suddenly squirmed out of Elena's arms, landed gracefully on the floor, walked directly to a nearby table where someone had left a data pad, and pushed it off the edge. The pad clattered to the ground. The cat sat down and began grooming himself, completely satisfied with his decision. "He just," Torque said, "destroyed Academy property. He's establishing dominance," Elena explained. "It's a whole thing." From the corner, Null finally spoke. "This is absurd. Commander Brext, surely you cannot be serious about integrating this pet into tactical operations." Brext's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement, or might have been a stress response. Honestly, at this point, he wasn't sure himself. "Cadet Null, Cadet Martinez and her companion have been cleared by Academy administration. They will be joining your tactical squadron for the upcoming War Games simulation." Every crystalline facet of Null's body seemed to sharpen at once. "My squadron?" "Commander, I must protest. I have been planning for the War Games for 6 weeks. My strategy is flawless. Adding untested variables at this stage will compromise everything." "Then I suggest you learn to adapt," Brext said. "War Games begin in 4 days. Consider this an opportunity to practice flexibility." Null's entire structure seemed to vibrate with barely contained frustration, which created a sound like wind chimes having an existential crisis. Elena smiled pleasantly. "Looking forward to working with you, Null. I've heard you're the best tactician in the Academy." "I am the best tactician in the Academy," Null corrected. "That is not opinion, that is statistical fact." "Great. Then you won't mind a little help from Professor Whiskers." Elena bent down and scooped up the cat, who had found a storage box marked Weapons Training Equipment and was attempting to sit in it. "He's really good at thinking outside the box, or in it. He's flexible." Professor Whiskers yawned, showing an impressive array of tiny, sharp teeth, then resumed staring at nothing in particular. Null watched them leave the orientation hall, his analytical mind already trying to calculate how this tiny creature could possibly be relevant to military tactics. His processors ran through thousands of scenarios. None of them made sense. Behind him, Torque leaned toward Vin. "I'm giving them 3 days before Null has them kicked off the team." "I'm giving them 2, Vin whispered back. "But I kind of hope they last longer. That cat is fascinating." Neither of them noticed that Professor Whiskers, from across the hall, had turned his head just slightly in their direction. The cat's eyes narrowed. Not with aggression, just with the ancient, unknowable awareness that cats have possessed since the dawn of time. The awareness that said, "I know something you don't," and in this case, that something was going to turn the entire academy upside down. The War Games briefing room smelled like anxiety and recycled air. Null had commandeered the largest holographic display and was currently projecting a tactical overview so complex it looked like someone had sneezed mathematics all over 3 dimensions. "Phase 1, Null announced to his assembled squadron. "We establish a defensive perimeter here, here, and here. Simultaneously, recon teams Alpha and Beta will scout these corridors. Phase 2 initiates exactly 17 minutes after deployment, contingent on enemy positions falling within these predicted zones, which they will, because I have analyzed the last 43 War Games simulations and identified clear patterns in Commander Brecht's scenario design." Torque, who was technically on Null's team but spent most of his time wishing he wasn't, raised one clawed hand. "What if the enemy doesn't follow the predicted patterns?" "They will," Null said, with the confidence of someone who had never been significantly wrong about anything. "The probability is 94.6%. But what about the 5.4% where irrelevant? We will account for minor deviations through contingency protocols 7 through 12. Across the table, Elena was leaning back in her chair with Professor Whiskers sprawled across her lap, like a furry, judgmental blanket. She'd been listening to Null's presentation for 45 minutes, with an expression of polite interest. "So," she said, when Null finally paused for breath, or whatever crystalline beings did instead of breathing, "maybe we could just wing it a little?" The room went so quiet, you could hear Vin's spores settling. Null rotated to face her with the slow, deliberate movement of a weapon system acquiring a target. "Wing it?" "Yeah, you know. Play it by ear. See what happens. Stay flexible." Elena scratched behind Professor Whiskers' ears. The cat's purring was audible across the room. "Some of the best tactical victories in Earth history came from commanders who threw out the plan and adapted in the moment." "That is," Null said slowly, "the single worst tactical advice I have ever heard. And I once heard Cadet Vin suggest we should try asking the enemy to surrender nicely." "Hey," Vin protested, "diplomacy is undervalued in modern warfare." "Vin, your species reproduces through spores. You attempted to diplomatically negotiate with a simulation that was literally programmed only to destroy you." "And I almost got through to it," Vin muttered. Elena shrugged. "Look, I'm just saying that overplanning can be as dangerous as underplanning. Sometimes you need to trust your instincts. Right, Professor Whiskers?" The cat opened one eye, looked directly at Null, then closed it again. It was somehow the most dismissive gesture anyone in the room had ever witnessed. "Your feline companion," Null said, his voice taking on an edge that sounded like breaking glass, "is asleep. He has been asleep for the entirety of this briefing. Explain to me how he contributes anything to tactical planning." "He's processing," Elena said. "Cats think differently than we do. Less linear, more intuitive." "Intuition is just pattern recognition that the conscious mind hasn't identified yet," Null countered. "And that creature's brain is approximately the size of a walnut. His pattern recognition capabilities are limited to identifying food sources and things to knock off elevated surfaces." As if on cue, Professor Whiskers stood up, stretched with the kind of elaborate flexibility that seemed anatomically improbable, stepped onto the tactical display table, and sat directly on top of Null's carefully arranged holographic projections. The display flickered. Several of Null's 17 phases disappeared under orange and white fur. Null said, and his voice actually glitched slightly. He just sat on my tactical overview. He does that, Elena confirmed. He sits on important things. It's like his whole deal. Torque was trying very hard not to laugh. He failed. It came out as a snorting sound that echoed through the briefing room. Even Vin was wobbling in what might have been amusement. Null carefully, very carefully, attempted to move Professor Whiskers off the tactical display. The cat went completely limp, employing the ancient feline technique of becoming somehow 3 times heavier through sheer force of will. This is unacceptable, Null said, now wrestling with 8 pounds of strategically uncooperative cat. Commander Brext, I formally request that Cadet Martinez and her companion be reassigned. Brext, who had been watching from the doorway and honestly enjoying himself for the first time in weeks, clicked his mandibles. Request denied. You will learn to work together, or you will fail together. War games begin in 2 days. I suggest you figure it out. Over the next 48 hours, Null's carefully constructed tactical worldview began to crack. Elena kept making suggestions that were, by any logical measure, terrible. What if we just don't defend that position? Why not split our forces even more? Have you considered doing the opposite of what your plan says? And yet somehow, when Null ran the simulations with her modifications, they improved. Not significantly. Just by margins of 2% here, 3% there. But it was enough to be noticeable. Enough to be maddening. Worse, Professor Whiskers kept appearing in places he shouldn't be. In the armory, sleeping on a pile of training equipment. In the navigation room, staring intently at star charts. In the commissary, judging cadets' food choices with his eyes. What is his purpose? Null demanded during one late-night planning session. What does he actually do? Elena looked up from where she was sketching modifications to his Phase 7 contingencies. He exists! Sometimes that's enough. That is not an answer. Sure it is. You're just not listening right. She paused. Question for you. Why do you need to control every variable? Because that is how victories are achieved. Through preparation, calculation, and the elimination of uncertainty. But uncertainty is part of war, Elena said. Clausewitz called it the fog of war. You can't eliminate it. You can only learn to move through it. Null was silent for a long moment. Then, you have studied military theory. Surprisingly, yes. Humans have been doing the whole warfare thing for a while now. We've picked up a few tricks. She smiled. Look, Null. Your plan is brilliant. It's probably the best tactical framework I've ever seen, but it's rigid. And when something unexpected happens, which it will, that rigidity becomes a weakness. So your solution is to introduce randomness, chaos, a cat? My solution is to stay loose, keep options open, trust that when things go sideways, you'll figure it out. She gestured to Professor Whiskers, who had somehow gotten into a supply closet and was now sitting in a helmet. Take him, for example. I never know what he's going to do. But I've learned that if I pay attention, his random behavior sometimes points me toward things I wasn't seeing. Is he actually tactical genius? Of course not. He's a cat. But the practice of reading chaos, of finding meaning in randomness, that's a skill. Null processed this. His entire crystalline structure shifted through several configurations as he thought. That is either profound or completely insane, he finally said. Why not both? Elena grinned. Trust me on this, Null. Or at least, trust Professor Whiskers. The cat, still in the helmet, meowed once. It echoed. I will consider it, Null said, which for him was basically a declaration of open-mindedness. The war games were tomorrow. And for the first time in his entire academy career, Cadet Null was going into a simulation without being completely certain he would win. It was the most uncomfortable feeling he'd ever experienced. It might also be exactly what he needed. The simulation dropped them into hell, not literally. Though several cadets later swore, it felt literal. The war games scenario was a contested urban environment on a hostile planet, complete with environmental hazards, limited resources, and enemies who were programmed to adapt to tactical patterns. It was designed to break even the most prepared teams. Null's team materialized in a bombed-out structure that might have once been a municipal building. His sensors immediately began cataloging exits, sight lines, and defensive positions. "Phase 1 commences now," Null announced, his voice carrying over the squad channel. "Talk, establish overwatch position at grid reference Delta 7. Vin, begin recon sweep north-northeast. Cadet Martinez..." "Elena." "Excuse me? Call me Elena. We're in a firefight situation. Let's keep it casual." Null's structure flickered with irritation. "Elena, you and your companion will remain with the core team and provide, and I'm quoting the roster here, auxiliary tactical consultation. Professor Whiskers prefers the term independent strategic observer," Elena said cheerfully. "But sure, we'll stick close." The cat, currently perched on Elena's shoulder, like the world's least intimidating parrot, surveyed the urban ruins with slitted eyes. For the first hour, everything went according to Null's plan, which was suspicious, honestly. His team captured 3 objectives, maintained their defensive perimeter, and encountered enemy forces exactly where his calculations predicted. Then the simulation's adaptation protocols kicked in. Suddenly, there were enemies in positions that shouldn't exist, supply drops that didn't match the pattern, environmental hazards that activated off-schedule. "This is not according to the scenario parameters," Null said, his voice tight. "Commander Brecht has introduced variables outside the established 43 simulation framework." "Sounds like war to me," Elena said. She was watching Professor Whiskers, who had leaped down from her shoulder and was now walking purposefully toward what looked like a collapsed tunnel. "Hey, Null! The cat's moving!" "I fail to see how that's relevant when we're currently pinned down by hostile fire from an unexpected vector." "Just trust me for a second. Where's he going?" Null, because his options were either follow a cat or admit he didn't have an immediate solution, tracked Professor Whiskers' movement on his sensors. The cat was heading toward the collapsed tunnel, then down it, into darkness where Null's sensors couldn't penetrate. "That creature is going to get lost, or terminated," Null said. "We cannot afford..." An explosion rocked their position. Enemy forces were closing in faster than his contingencies could account for. "Permission to follow my gut?" Elena asked. "You don't need my permission to..." "Great, I'm following the cat. Torque, Vin, you coming?" Torque, who had been in second place so many times he'd stopped counting, found himself making a split-second decision. Follow Null's crumbling plan, or follow the human chasing a cat through a war zone? "This is the stupidest thing I've ever done," Torque rumbled, but he followed. Vin wobbled excitedly and brought up the rear. Null stood alone in the defensive position, watching his carefully assembled team abandon his tactical framework to pursue a small orange and white creature who was currently investigating a piece of rubble with intense focus. His options were limited. Stay and be overwhelmed, or follow them and abandon everything he'd planned. "This is not how warfare is conducted," Null said to no one in particular. Then he followed the cat. The collapsed tunnel led to an underground transit system that wasn't on any of the simulation maps. Professor Whiskers trotted through the darkness like he owned it, occasionally pausing to sniff corners or stare at walls. "Why are we following him?" Null demanded, his voice echoing off ancient tile. "Because he's going somewhere," Elena said, "and everywhere he's taken me before has been interesting." "Interesting is not a tactical parameter." "Maybe it should be." Professor Whiskers stopped. His tail went up. He stared intently at what appeared to be a solid wall. Elena examined it more closely. "There's an access panel here, hidden pretty well. If we can get through..." Torque pushed forward and simply smashed through the wall with one massive fist. Beyond it was a network of maintenance tunnels that led directly into the enemy's rear positions. Null's sensors lit up. From here, they could flank 3 enemy concentrations simultaneously. It was perfect. Better than perfect. It was an opportunity his original plan would never have created. "How did that creature know this was here?" Null asked. Elena shrugged. He didn't. He just wanted to see what was behind the wall. Cats are curious like that. "So we're winning because of random feline curiosity? Is it random? Or are we just calling it random because we don't understand the pattern yet?" Elena grinned. "Stop trying to understand it and just use it." For the next 3 hours, Null experienced the single most chaotic, unpredictable, and somehow successful tactical operation of his entire life. Every time his plan started to solidify, Professor Whiskers would wander off in a direction that made no sense. And every time, following him led to advantages. A sudden sprint to chase what might have been a holographic mouse led them away from an artillery strike. A pause to investigate a supply crate caused them to miss a trap. A determined effort to fit into a box that was clearly too small resulted in them discovering a hidden weapons cache. "This is insane," Null kept repeating. "This is warfare," Elena corrected. "You're just finally seeing what it actually looks like." They captured objectives, they outmaneuvered enemies. They adapted on the fly, combining Null's tactical framework with Elena's improvisational chaos and Professor Whiskers' complete indifference to any kind of plan whatsoever, and they started winning. The final objective sat in the center of a plaza that was definitely a kill zone. Every approach was covered by enemy positions, every angle was accounted for. It was the kind of tactical puzzle that Null normally loved. Except now, he was approaching it with a team that included a human who kept suggesting they just try things and see what happens. And a cat who was currently grooming himself despite being in an active combat simulation. "Standard assault approach is a suicide," Null calculated aloud. "We need to eliminate the overwatch positions before advancing, which requires either aerial support we don't have, or a flanking maneuver that will take 47 minutes we also don't have." "Imor," Eleanor said, watching Professor Whiskers. "We could do something weird." "Weird is not a tactical classification?" "Then let's call it unconventional. Look, we're not going to outthink the scenario. Brex designed this simulation knowing exactly how you operate. He's predicted every logical move you could make." Null's crystalline structure dimmed slightly, which might have been the equivalent of a frown. "You're saying my tactical approach is predictable. I'm saying you're a genius, but you think like a genius. You optimize, you calculate, you find the perfect solution." Eleanor leaned against a broken wall. "But what if there is no perfect solution? What if the only way through is to do something that makes no sense? That is contradictory to everything I understand about warfare. Welcome to chaos theory. Now watch the cat." Professor Whiskers had stopped grooming. His ears were up. He was staring at something in the distance that none of them could see. Then he bolted. Straight across the plaza, directly through the kill zone, moving with that impossible feline agility, zigging and zagging in patterns that no tactical computer could predict, because they weren't patterns at all. They were pure instinct and reflex. Enemy fire tracked him, and missed. Because you can't predict true randomness. You can only react to it, and by the time you react, it's already somewhere else. "He's drawing their fire," Torque breathed. "That little maniac is pulling their attention." "He's not drawing anything," Elena said, already moving. "He just saw something he wanted to chase, but yeah, we can absolutely use this. Null, can you give me a firing solution on those overwatch positions while they're distracted?" For one crystalline moment, Null experienced something he'd never felt before. The sensation of releasing control, of accepting that chaos wasn't the enemy of strategy, it was just another variable. One you couldn't eliminate, so you had to embrace. "Firing solutions calculated," he said. "Torque, suppressing fire on positions 3 through 7. Vin, create a spore screen to obscure their sensors. Elena, you and I will advance through the confusion and neutralize the command post." "Now you're talking," Elena said, grinning. They moved, and it was beautiful. Null's calculations provided the framework. Elena's instincts found the gaps. Torque's raw firepower cleared paths. Vin's biological countermeasures kept them hidden. And somewhere in the chaos, Professor Whiskers was single-handedly causing an entire enemy battalion to waste ammunition, shooting at a small orange target that simply refused to follow any logical movement pattern. They reached the command post. Null's simulated weapon systems were more than adequate for the task. "Objective secured," the simulation's AI announced. "Cadet Null's team achieves victory. Time, 3 hours, 42 minutes, 17 seconds. This represents the second fastest completion time in War Games history." The simulation dissolved. They were back in the training hall, surrounded by observation screens showing replays of their operation. Commander Brext approached, all four arms moving in what might have been applause or might have been bewilderment. Cadet Null. That was the single most unorthodox tactical performance I have ever witnessed. I designed that final scenario to be unsolvable through conventional means. I expected you to negotiate or withdraw. Instead, you, and I am quoting the tactical analysis here, followed a cat through a kill zone and somehow made it work. It was, Null said slowly, a learning experience. I'll say. Cadet Martinez, your contribution was significant, and your companion, unusual as he is, provided what the analysis is calling aggressive randomization of enemy targeting protocols. Brext paused. Did you train him to do that? Elena scooped up Professor Whiskers, who looked extremely proud of himself, despite having no understanding of what he'd just accomplished. Honestly, no. He just does his thing. I've just learned to work with it instead of against it. Null approached them. His crystalline structure had shifted into a configuration that might have been respect. I was wrong, he said, which might have been the first time those words had ever left his structure. About dismissing your approach, about assuming control was the only path to victory, about the cat. His name is Professor Whiskers, Elena reminded him. About Professor Whiskers, Null corrected. You were correct. Chaos is not the enemy of strategy. It is simply another element to incorporate. My tactical framework created the structure. Your willingness to embrace uncertainty found opportunities within that structure. Together, we achieved something neither of us could have alone. Look at you, learning teamwork, Elena said warmly. I'm proud of you. I am not a child to be praised, Null said, but his structure brightened slightly. In talk lumbered over, and for the first time in his academy career, he didn't look bitter about coming in second. Mostly because for once, he'd come in third. That was actually fun. I can't believe I'm saying this, but fighting alongside you all was actually enjoyable. We should celebrate, Vin bubbled excitedly, all of us, as a team. I know a great place that serves nutrient paste in 17 flavors. We could talk about tactics and bonding and... Vin, Null said gently. That sounds acceptable. Vin froze mid-wobble. Wait, really? Really? Though I draw the line at trying all 17 flavors. Professor Whiskers meowed, which everyone chose to interpret as agreement. As they filed out of the training hall, Elena fell into step beside Null. So, you going to keep working with us, or are you going back to solo tactical genius mode? Null was quiet for a moment. I believe I have discovered that even tactical geniuses benefit from diverse perspectives, and apparently from cats. Though I still do not fully understand how that creature's behavior translates to tactical advantage. That's the neat part, Elena said. You're not supposed to understand it. You're just supposed to trust it. Trust is illogical. And yet here we are. Null couldn't argue with that. The week after the War Games saw a remarkable change in the Galactic Naval Academy. Cadet Null, previously known for working alone, completing assignments in isolation, and generally treating social interaction like a mathematical problem with no solution, started showing up to team planning sessions. He still dominated most of them. He was still, statistically speaking, the best tactical mind in the academy. But now he occasionally paused to ask, does anyone have alternative perspectives? Which for Null was basically equivalent to a heartfelt speech about friendship. Eleanor had settled into academy life with the kind of easy confidence that suggested she'd been there for years, instead of days. She aced her simulations not through Null's perfect calculations, but through aggressive improvisation and a willingness to try solutions that made instructors nervous. Professor Whiskers had somehow become the Academy's unofficial mascot. Cadets left offerings of food near his favorite sleeping spots. Rumors circulated that touching him before a simulation brought good luck. He remained utterly indifferent to all of this, as cats generally are. Commander Brext called Elena into his office 3 days after the War Games. She entered to find him at his desk, all 4 arms working on different data pads simultaneously. Cadet Martinez, sit. Elena sat. Professor Whiskers, who had followed her because he went where he pleased, jumped onto Brext's desk and immediately knocked a stylus onto the floor. Brext watched it roll away. I've been reviewing your academy application. You scored exceptionally high on adaptive thinking assessments. Your tactical knowledge is comprehensive, but here's what I'm curious about. That story you told Null about incorporating the cat's random behavior into your strategy. That was partially fabricated, wasn't it? Elena's expression didn't change. I'm not sure what you mean, Commander. I mean that you've been studying Null's performance records since before you arrived. I mean that you deliberately built your entire tactical approach around complementing his weaknesses. And I mean that while Professor Whiskers is indeed just a cat doing cat things, you've become exceptionally skilled at pretending his random actions are strategically relevant, which causes everyone else to slow down and reconsider their assumptions. That's a very specific accusation, Elena said carefully. It's not an accusation, it's respect. Brext leaned back. Null is brilliant but rigid. You recognize that his greatest weakness is his inability to adapt when his perfect plans meet imperfect reality. So, you introduced maximum chaos in the form of a cat, forced him to adapt or fail, and in the process taught him the single most important lesson in warfare, that sometimes the best strategy is having no strategy at all. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. Professor Whiskers really is just a cat, though. I'm not controlling him or anything. I know. That's what makes it genius. You're not manufacturing chaos. You're just harnessing what was already there. Brext clicked his mandibles in what might have been amusement. Tell me something. What made you think this would work? Honestly, I wasn't sure it would. But I knew Null needed someone who would challenge him without threatening him. Someone who operated so differently from him that he couldn't dismiss them as simply inferior. She scratched Professor Whiskers behind the ears. And I figured a cat was about as different from a crystalline tactical genius as you could get. You figured correctly. That team exercise shifted something in Null. He's actually talking to other cadets now, asking questions, considering alternatives. You might have done more for his development in 1 week than I managed in 2 years. He did the hard part, Elena said. I just gave him a reason to try. Brext nodded slowly. You'll go far in the fleet, Cadet Martinez, assuming you can keep that cat from causing a diplomatic incident. No promises on that front, sir. Later that evening, Elena found Null in one of the observation lounges, watching simulated starfields through the massive windows. She sat down next to him, Professor Whiskers settling into her lap. I've been thinking, Null said without preamble, about chaos and randomness and the tactical applications thereof. Dangerous hobby for you? I have concluded that your feline companion is not in fact providing tactical guidance. He is simply being a cat. You have been interpreting his random behaviors and using them as prompts to reconsider tactical assumptions. Elena smiled. Took you a week to figure that out? It took me 2 days. I spent the remaining 5 days determining whether I should be angry about the deception. His structure shifted into a new configuration. I have concluded that anger is inappropriate. You provided exactly what I needed, which was a compelling reason to question my own certainty. And here I thought you'd be mad that I'd been studying your tactics before we met. I would have done the same. In fact, I have now begun studying your performance records. Your adaptive capabilities are extraordinary. You scored in the 99th percentile on improvisation assessments. And you scored in the 99th percentile on pretty much everything else, Elena pointed out. We're a good team, Null. We are an effective team, Null corrected. Good implies subjective emotional attachment. We're friends, Null. Null was silent for a long moment, his crystalline structure cycling through several colors. I am not familiar with the protocols for friendship. My species does not typically engage in social bonding outside of tactical necessity. Lucky for you, friendship doesn't really have protocols. You just kind of show up for people, support them, occasionally make them question their fundamental assumptions about warfare using a cat. That seems inefficient. It's very inefficient, but it's worth it. Null processed this. Then I suppose we are friends. There you go. Was that so hard? Yes, extremely. I may need to lie down for several hours to recover from this social interaction. Elena laughed. Professor Whiskers, sensing an opportunity, jumped from her lap to Null's crystalline structure. For a moment it seemed like the cat might slide right off. But he found purchase somehow, settling into a spot between two geometric planes that seemed designed specifically for napping. "He is on me," Null said, his voice uncertain. "What is the appropriate response?" "Just let him sit there. If you try to move him, he'll just make himself heavier through spite. It's a cat thing. I am being sat upon by a creature whose brain is the size of a walnut, and I am allowing this to happen." "Character growth," Elena said sagely. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. After a few minutes, Null's structure began emitting a very soft, harmonic sound. Elena glanced over, curious. Are you purring?" "I am not purring. Crystalline entities do not purr. I am simply resonating at a frequency that happens to be soothing to carbon-based life forms." "That's purring, Null. It is resonating. You're resonating like a cat purrs, therefore you're purring. Your logic is flawed, but I am too comfortable to argue properly." Professor Whiskers, for his part, had achieved peak cat contentment. He was warm, he was elevated, and he was receiving attention. That nothing about this situation made tactical sense was irrelevant. He was a cat. Tactical sense had never been his concern. Down the hall, Torque passed by and glanced into the observation lounge. He saw Null, the Academy's most brilliant and antisocial cadet, sitting peacefully with a human and a cat on his lap. The reptilian shook his head in amazement. "Unbelievable," he muttered, but he was smiling. Vin wobbled past a moment later, saw the same scene, and immediately pulled out his datapad to document it. "This is historic. This is unprecedented. This is the best thing I've seen all semester. I need to tell everyone. Actually, no, I'll just watch quietly so I don't disturb them. But I'm very excited about watching quietly." Commander Brext, reviewing daily reports in his office, received a notification about unusual activity in the observation lounge. He pulled up the security feed, saw what was happening, and allowed himself a rare smile. "Sometimes," he said to no one in particular, "the best tactical decision is knowing when to do absolutely nothing." He closed the feed and went back to his reports. In the observation lounge, Elena broke the comfortable silence. "So, what do you think, Null? Ready for next semester?" "I believe so. Though I intend to implement new protocols for team integration and chaos management. I have prepared preliminary frameworks for 17 different scenarios." "Of course you have. However, I am also prepared to deviate from those frameworks if circumstances require, or if Professor Whiskers indicates an alternative approach." "Look at you, embracing flexibility." "I am attempting to achieve a balance between structure and improvisation. It is challenging. I do not enjoy being challenged, but I am learning to tolerate it." "That's all any of us can do," Elena said. "Learn and adapt, stay humble, trust your team. And trust the cat. Always trust the cat." Professor Whiskers opened one eye, looked at both of them with that ancient feline wisdom that might have been profound or might have been him thinking about dinner, then closed it again. The three of them sat there as the simulated stars wheeled overhead, an unlikely team that had somehow become something more. A friendship built on tactical genius, adaptive chaos, and one very judgmental orange cat who had absolutely no idea he'd changed the course of several lives, but that was fine. He didn't need to know. He was a cat. He had naps to take, and boxes to sit in, and an entire academy full of things to knock off tables. And somewhere in the Galactic Naval Academy, future legends were being forged, not through perfection, but through the willingness to embrace imperfection. Not through control, but through the courage to let go, also through cats. Definitely through cats. The universe was a chaotic place, but maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what made it worth fighting for.